Hello, everyone, and welcome from wherever you're listening, whether it's outer space or here, home on Earth. Welcome to the Saturn Force Podcast. I'm your host, Andy, aka Love Retro BTW on Instagram and Twitter, and Cafe BTW on YouTube and TikTok. Welcome to the first inaugural episode of the Saturn Force Podcast. I'm excited about this, and I wanted to do something a little bit with a shade of seriousness and casualness. Is casualness a word? I think so, but don't quote me. Now, what is it about the Sega Saturn that I want to go as far as to create a podcast around? The Sega Saturn was ill appreciated in the 90s when it was released in the US, appreciated well and received well in Japan and other countries, but sold extremely poorly in the United States. I am American. I know it was sold in Europe and in Canada. Canada and the US share in the same region. So if you go to Canada and you buy a Saturn game, you'll see the white cases, just like the US cases. So they are the same, just so people that would, maybe not know that. But not to go down rabbit holes. I'm really excited about this because I've been wanting to just talk about the Saturn. And I hope to have some guests on with me. I hope to have some conversations around the Saturn, but I think because it's the inaugural episode of the Sega Saturn, I should get right into the meat of the show and what to expect from future shows. So, the way I see it is we'll do an intro, we'll talk a little bit. I'll talk about some current things happening in my Saturn life because I'm sure you want to know why I want to talk about the Saturn, so I will get into that. So we'll always talk about something current around the Saturn as much as I could find any news about the Saturn that is current, besides just collecting it. There could be some cool story around it that someone's talking about. It could be a collection story too. I don't know. I'm just going with the flow, and you're all on this ride with me. But I am so excited. And you must be saying, well, what else can we expect from that, Andy? Well, I think it's just a podcast for people who love the Saturn, and there's going to be things that I know or have known about the Saturn, whether it's the US version, the Japanese version. But we're going to dig into things I need to learn about the Saturn, and that is something that I want to do with you. I will obviously tell everyone my story of why I'm doing this and what is it about the Saturn that is so near and dear to my heart. And that's really simple. I was one of those kids in the US that had a really good upbringing. I'm not going to, I'm not bragging at all. I'm just saying that I was very lucky. My dad was pretty successful. He was a little wild with his money, but we were, a family in the 80s and early 90s when the economy was kind of booming in the 80s, where my dad once quoted, almost everyone is making something, son. Which isn't true. There was plenty of problems in the 80s and 90s. But that said, my dad didn't know anything about video games, whether he didn't care to watch us play video games. He might have looked at the screen for 3 seconds, maybe 3 to 4 times that I could remember. But what did he do? He bought us games and he bought us consoles. He's one of those parents, and my mom is completely sort of oblivious to video games as well, and she buys us video games. But my dad used to treat us all the time and buy us video games all the way in the early 80s. Far back, I remember the Atari 2600, but it was the NES when my brother received that. The 1985 marketing NES, by the way, there was the NES was released in 1985 in very different markets. It wasn't a mass release till 86. And we were a part of that like metropolitan New York City area where they did that market push, and we did get the Rob original NES kit, But it was later on in my video game life that my parents eventually were going through a really rough patch, and this is fast forward to a part of my life that was pretty difficult as a kid. We said we'll be a little bit serious here. And I think that a part of my upbringing has a lot to do why I love the Sega Saturn. And I'm going to get to that. So that's another thing. I like to talk, and these stories are going to be long-winded, just like Norm Macdonald. Rest in peace, my friend. So what's the reason things got rough? It's circa 1994, 1993 to start. My parents started having problems, and you know, they mentioned the word divorce, and I was maybe 11, 12 at the time. I had a Genesis with everything you think of, the 3DX, the Sega CD. It looked like a transformer, for Christ's sake. With my brother having a lot of Nintendo stuff in his room, whether it was the NES or whatever. But that said, my parents were getting a divorce, and my dad moved out, and he moved into an apartment, and life went on. My parents were working on a really terrible divorce at a time in my life that I didn't really truly understand or grasp the reason my parents wanted to break up. I was one of those kids that was confused. And what's really interesting about this story is I still remember, like, if you look back at it, I'm one of those kids that divorce affected very strongly, where I didn't quite understand why, because I was that young that I didn't really get the idea that my parents will no longer be together. My brother was 3 years older than me, so he was more of a teenager. He was kind of somewhat oblivious to it. I almost feel like my brother was never really affected by my parents' divorce. But you're like, Andy, why are you telling us about your parents' divorce? Well, I'm getting there. Later on, my dad meets another woman. It turns out to be the woman my dad had an affair with. Yeah, my dad didn't just get a divorce with my mother, he had an affair with my mother. Now, don't get me wrong. I love my dad. My dad is not a bad person. Did he do some bad things to my mom? Did he cheat on her? Yeah, he sure did. But at some point, as you get older, you realize, my dad wasn't in love with my mom anymore. I wish he would have gotten a divorce sooner, but that's another story for another time. Long story short, this woman that he had an affair with ends up becoming my stepmother. So she actually becomes a part of my life too. And to this day, I'm very close with her. As a teenager, we hated each other, but I'm very close with her. Till this day. She's my stepmother, and later on things changed. But the long and the short of it is, my dad goes to me and my brother. He says, "Look, Dionysia, or my stepmother, we called her D for short. She's a fiery Dominican from Spanish Harlem in New York. Uh, so I grew up around this Dominican culture, you know, as well through my stepmother, who, later my dad marries. But he goes, look, I'm taking it really seriously with D, and I want her to move into my apartment. Are you guys okay with that?" And I was a little not okay with it because, like, I'm the one that's like a little still upset and still affected by my parents' divorce and the fact that my dad lives in an apartment and now he wants this like woman that he's being with to move in. And he's like, look, and I hate to tell you the story this way, but he did bribe me in so many ways when you look back on it. Because what can I get you? Is there anything coming out now that you would just like want that I could buy you, and maybe you'll just look the other way for a little bit? I know it sounds so conceited, but I was really a brat of a kid. I didn't really like what my dad did by moving out, so I was a little hard on him. But at the same time, I was thinking in my head, it's 1995. Maybe I just want to say, it's the early summer, and there's magazines coming out, and you're hearing about the Sega Saturn being released, which was released a little bit earlier than expected. And it was selling for, I believe, and don't quote me, in the US for $400. And remember, 1995, something that was $400, the inflation, it's got to be more than that now. So my dad looked at me and he says, all right, where do we get this thing? And I'm like, Dad, you know where we get these things. But actually, Toys R Us at the time didn't have the Sega Saturn. And I was looking at other stores and they didn't have the Sega Saturn. But you know who did? If you grew up in the metropolitan area in New York City and you know Joe Namath, Nobody Beats the Wiz, which was also mocked in Seinfeld with the Wiz, was a sort of Best Buy before Best Buy, where you would walk in and it had everything. You had like car audio, you had TVs, you had washers and dryers, appliances, Nobody Beats the Wiz had everything, and it was super cool. And Joe Namath would do these commercials and say, "Nobody beats the Wiz." And like it was a huge like metropolitan area like commercial. So we went in there, and I still to this day vividly recall this time going in there and buying it. That is how, as you get older, I'm 41 years old now, and we recorded this in 2022. If you're listening, years from now to this episode, um, you know, it was a different time. I, I must say, anyway, getting lost in the first episode, getting lost in it a little bit, but let me come back. So we're in the Wiz. I still remember the guy turning around and opening this case that had like not only systems in it, but I can recall there were like VCRs or like expensive electronics, whether they were stereo tuners and stuff like that. And he pulls out the box and puts it on the counter. And at the time, I think my dad used a credit card. I don't think he used cash for this, but I could be wrong. And that was it. And the rest was history. I was one of those kids in the 80s. I mean, in the mid 90s, that was one of your friends that, oh my God, Andy has a Sega Saturn. And like most people didn't, right? I didn't know anyone else out of my friend group that had a Sega Saturn except for my cousin, who was pretty on par with like video games like I was. Like my aunt bought him a lot of stuff. So like he had a Jaguar, I had a Jaguar. He had a Genesis, I had a Genesis. He was 3 years younger than me. So we all lived like I had my little cousin, my older brother who was 3 years older than me, and then but yeah, it's all because of divorce. And I think I look back on this and I'm like, well, you went through like as a kid this like really turbulent time in your adolescent years where your mind was confused and didn't really understand until later why your parents needed to get divorced, which I think, look, it happens. People fall out of love, and to be happy again, you have to find someone new and decide, hey, this is something we have to do and break up. But it's just a really connected story, and that's why I ended up later, fast forward to 2008, where I'm living in LA. And keep in mind, I grew up in North Jersey and South Florida. I lived for a little bit. Um, and I started buying Sega Saturn games, including the collection I had. I had my original Saturn games. So I had pretty much like 30 of my original games. Not my whole collection. I had a lot more than that. I have a Saturn as well. I bought one later on for pretty cheap, like $60. But it was like I would go to the store circa 2008, and in LA, there was one store that I knew of that was like really close, and that's Game Dude, which is like a 33 plus year old store that's been around for years. And I remember that's where I literally was like in 2009. Their Sega Saturn collections, I mean, their section, they were mad games. And I bought tons of Saturn games throughout the years at Game Dude in particular. But I also bought Saturn games through eBay a little bit back in the day. So I was buying Saturn games before they got to where they are now. But I think, people are always like, I think throwing shade to the Saturn and the fact that it's super highly priced, but when you look back on it, it's actually not like Sega's fault that today, I mean, it is, but what I'm saying is if it was a market success, there might be a better chance that we sold more games and Saturn games wouldn't be so pricey as they are today. And that's where this story of like wanting to do this podcast and wanting to like kind of like pull my sleeves up and at the same time like take off my pants and talk about in a casual serious way how much I love this thing, and can I do kind of like a retrospective podcast about this damn thing because I have so many memories. I have a lot of games, and I can talk to you through this journey of me trying to get a complete collection of Sega Saturn American Run games. And that is a true story. Even to this day, I'm looking for certain games that I still need, but I'm going to buy them really smartly, whether it is working with a retro gaming hunter that will give me a decent price on something, like kind of like a hunting cost price, or I find it in the wild, which, to be honest with you, and we'll talk about it, I found some great games in the wild that today just wouldn't be able to. Now, recently, I found a game that I did not have in my collection even as far back as the old days, and that's Albert Odyssey, which is probably, geez, just such a great RPG. And you look back on this damn system, and we're not going to go long on this first episode. I just kind of want to make it an introductory episode, and I'm still debating if this is going to be a monthly podcast, and I think it will be. I think, in all honesty, I want to do like a long form Sega Saturn podcast, and it might be 2 a month, maybe just 1 a month, but we'll rotate. But it's going to be all audio, and it's the Saturn Force Podcast, and the name, right? Originally, I was going to call it the Saturn Parallax Podcast, which sounds super cool, right? It sounds so cool. But I don't want to make it difficult to say, because parallax is kind of a word that it rings off your tongue, but at the same time, I feel like people are going to have trouble saying it. So I need to go with something that's more like easy to say and kind of also fits the brand. And what's interesting is I feel like Saturn Force is the name of a Saturn game, right? You would have a game called Saturn Force. And I think I've already thought of the idea for the logo of this podcast. And the logo of the podcast, I just literally, with you on this inaugural episode, whether I have the logo up already, know what the logo is going to be. And I'm so stoked to share it with you right now, because it just popped into my head visually as I'm describing it to you guys and gals. And it's a white Sega Saturn, case, but it just says Saturn Force, and maybe it has a picture of me with my microphone, and it looks like a Saturn video game. And you got Burning Rangers and Guardian Heroes. The Saturn had all these games that just had really heroic names. So I just love the idea of Saturn Force Podcast, and it's just as simple as that, the Saturn Force. And I think that'll be easy for people to say. I think it's pretty powerful. Yes, I know it sounds simple, but I promise you, I went through a lot of different variations of this name, and I wanted to just decide at the end of it, let's go with the easiest way to say this damn podcast, the Saturn Force Podcast, all right? Because we're a force to be reckoned with. I was Googling a lot of, like, are there a lot of Saturn podcasts out there? There is like a group that does Saturn focused content, and I don't know if I actually, their name is I can't remember their name, but that's okay, because it doesn't matter. This isn't for competition. This is just a supplementary content, because I love podcasting, and I'm like, what else could I talk about just to give one more thing? So that said, I think we'll wrap this up, because this is just an introduction, because I want to get an idea if you enjoyed the story I shared, and if this is a podcast you might be interested in, whether you know anything about the Sega Saturn. I think that it might interest people that don't know anything about this system. Maybe it's a system you missed out on. So the Saturn Force Podcast is here, and I am so excited to share it with you all. And we will do other things like take questions from people or do polls. I do want to have some guests on here where we could do some long form breakdown interviews. I love talking to people. If you've ever seen Cafe BTW, a morning gaming podcast, on my Twitch channel, and I'm sure I'll share you my link tree on this podcast so you can check out my other content. But yeah, this sounds fun. And I'm so glad you sat with me, whether you were in outer space or here on Earth. I'm Andy. Love Retro BTW on Twitter or Instagram, and Cafe BTW on TikTok and YouTube. My podcast is Cafe BTW, a gaming morning podcast. And check out the Gaming Twitter retro community. If you go to my Twitter and you check the pinned tweet, you could join our retro gaming community that has over 1,600 members, and we do giveaways every month. But this was the Saturn Force Podcast inaugural episode. And thanks so much for listening to my crazy story about my childhood and my parents' divorce. But that is how I got connected to it. Now, my question to you, and we'll ask a question at the end of every show. My question to you, was there ever a system, a video game that was purchased out of guilt, or you made your parents feel guilty so they bought you a video game or a console? That said, have a great night and wonderful dreams. I'm Andy.